Very good. Okay, so welcome back. This is the section of the mini lecture series on the disease itself, the disease of bubonic plague or Black Death. So for our purposes, the term Black Death is essentially synonymous with plague. Plague has come metonymically to mean any virulent disease, or actually even a kind of disastrous evil or affliction that need not be associated with disease. So you can think of it's a plague on society, or a plague on the system of education, or something like that. In its original form in Latin, which is from where we get the word, it simply meant a smiting or a complete slaughter, and again didn't need to be associated with illness specifically. And you might think of, like in biblical examples, how God sent plagues, the plague upon Egypt, or the kind of plague of different types of calamities or disasters that weren't necessarily illness. In the 14th century, during the Black Death, authors spoke of, they didn't speak of the Black Death, that's a 19th century term. They would talk about the great evil, or the great death, the great mortality. Plague can technically refer to the disease that we'll be talking about. Here, let me show you. Yersinia pestis. Right, it can specifically deal with Yersinia pestis. The term Black Death, and you can see the definition I've given you from the Oxford English Dictionary, came into use only in the 18th century. It was coined by a Norwegian historian, really just looking to find a metaphor for the Great Pandemic, sort of talking about it in the same way that people talk about the Dark Ages, which is not a term that we like to use, the Black Death being associating with a period of time and the experience of the pandemic. And properly speaking, Black Death is used to refer to the pandemic, right? The Black Death struck Europe, and not the disease itself, which would be referred to as plague, but actually now people frequently just talk about the Black Death as the disease itself. So what is plague? It's a bacterial disease, which means that it can now be treated with antibiotics. This is in distinction to COVID, which is a viral disease, which is a different, it's caused by a virus, not a bacterium. The disease is caused by the bacillus, which is the strain of bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and I'm showing you here a picture of it. The name comes from a Swiss pathologist and bacteriologist named Alexander Yersin. Here he is. He was actually a student of Louis Pasteur. And Yersin identified the pathogen in Hong Kong in 1894 during the third great pandemic of the plague. It should be noted that at the same time, and probably within days or weeks of each other, Shibasuburo Kitasato, a Japanese researcher, also identified the same bacillus. So to identify or just describe the plague, we're going to take these in two sets of threes. We're going to discuss the three main pandemics that are caused by Yersinia pestis, and discuss the three different forms that plague takes. So the three pandemics. There have been three widespread pandemics in world history caused by this disease. The first, and Snowden goes over in the main text that you're using, goes over these. So the first one seems to have emerged in the 6th century. We usually refer to it as the Justinianic plague because it emerged and affected the Mediterranean. You can there follow the yellow-orange set of arrows. It infected the Byzantine world, the late Roman world, during the reign of the Emperor Justinian, and it ran from the Middle East through the Mediterranean, killing approximately 25% of the populations south of the Alps in the Mediterranean. So it seems to have begun in the southern cone of Africa, and its first appearance in humans is documented to 541. And it infected all parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe, and seems to have run its course by about 755. That's its last documentation. The Black Death, which is what is primarily concerning us here, this one starts, as we saw last time, sometime in the 30s in Central Asia, and it's documented in Europe starting in 1347. It appears virulently in the middle of the 14th century, and it will come in regular waves up through about 1500. And after that, it will appear sporadically throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, often in cities, like often there's a famous plague of London in 1666, 67. And then the final major outbreak of this pandemic was in Marseille in 1720 to 22. The third pandemic, and here you want to focus on the Black Arrow, this is modern plague. This again came out of Central Asia and seems to have reemerged at the end of the 19th century. The earliest known case is 1866, where it spread through Canton province and then to Hong Kong, and then it spread out slowly from there. This is, of course, the context in which the two researchers, right, Yersin and Kitasato, started work on identifying it. And Yersin actually went to Hong Kong in 94 after learning of an outbreak in China, and he obviously got to work on it. So outbreaks were documented into the 20th century throughout all 5 continents. Snowden says that the pandemic killed as many as 20 million people, mostly between 1898 and 1910, and in the Indian subcontinent was probably the hardest and most affected. It should be said that plague still exists. Seems that there's about 1,000 to 3,000 cases of plague reported globally every year, about 10 to 15 cases every year in the US. Here's a map taken from Wikipedia. Now, of course, it can be treated by antibiotics and isn't as virulent, although there are reports of deaths with some regularity of plague. So there was a long debate about whether Yersinia pestis, right, that bacillus of the third pandemic, was the same strain as the one caused by the Black Death. But this as a debate has been definitively put to rest, partly or rather entirely on the work of plague graveyards, particularly an important London graveyard from 1348-49. In which paleoarchaeologists, bioarchaeologists, and paleogeneticists have put the new ability to work on historical microbiology, and they were able to positively identify the disease that ravaged the world in the 14th century as Yersinia pestis, as the same strain that reemerged at the end of the 19th century. And the famous study seems to have been done in 2005, and there's ongoing work about isolating and being able to track the early history of the disease. So the disease is transmitted to humans from fleas. One second, here we have the rat flea. You have on the left, you have just a rat flea, and on the right, you have a rat flea who has infected his gut with the bacterium, and that's that big black splotch that you see. So that is a plague-carrying flea, poor sod. The flea gets it from an infected rodent, a rat or a marmot, which usually arrives into the community or the household on usually an animal, a rat or another form of rodent, or alternatively, cloth, bedding, or other stuffs in which they had nestled. And here you might recall the story that you read in Gabriel de Musis. This appears on page 20, where he says that there's a soldier was camped, an army was camped outside a city, and 4 soldiers went out in search of in search of food probably, and they found an abandoned house, and they found a fleece, and they took the fleece, and they slept under the fleece that night, and they all got plague and died. And it's probably just the fleece was infected with fleas. It should be said that fleas much prefer rats to humans, and they will always choose a rat over a human, and it is only when they have killed the rats, or that plague has killed the rats, that they jump to humans. Actually, one of the mysteries or the confusions in the archaeology is there doesn't seem to be enough dead evidence, archaeological evidence of enough dead rats in the archaeological record to sort of square the circle. That's one of those ongoing debates. Plague is extremely virulent and highly morbid. Again, it's contagious, it is transmitted easily, and once infected, it has a very high mortality rate. It comes in 3 forms. So, what are those forms? We have bubonic plague. This is the most common, and it's the one which it gets its name from. It is named for the buboes that are most visibly associated with it and identify it. And it's the version of the disease with which the whole disease has become synonymous. A flea bite would inject the human host. Incubation would last somewhere from 2 to 6 or even up to 8 days. A high fever of up to 105 would ensue with convulsions, with vomiting, with high sensitivity to light, and agonizing pain in the limbs. And this description is coming from modern, modern scientific descriptions of it. It actually coincides very clearly with de Musis's account of what he was observing in the plague victims that he knew. But you might imagine a kind of really awful superflu. On the 2nd or 3rd day after the start of the fever, a swelling the size of what they call an egg or a small apple would often appear on in the lymphatic node closest to the bite. Here's a picture of a modern plague victim. This comes actually just from Wikipedia. This was often in the groin area because obviously fleas probably closest to the ground would bite your feet and ankles, but it could also be on the neck or armpits. They were extremely painful and apparently agonizingly painful, and sometimes these would be accompanied by small sort of liver spots, crimson spots, all over the body. So this was awful. If a patient might just die of exhaustion or heart failure or internal hemorrhage, but if they got through that, they could begin to convalesce in about 8 to 10 days. The death rate, the mortality rate seems to have been about 50%. That is 1 out of 2 people who contracted it would die. Though it may have been even greater in the 50s and 60s, 1340s, 50s and 60s, because for reasons that we only gestured at last time, there had been a whole series of other pressures on the health of Europeans in the first half of the 14th century, particularly the great famine of the end of the 1315, 1316, 17. And that continued as well, but also other forms of downgrading of environmental healths that may have weakened the population's ability to withstand it. You might I'm not getting reliable numbers on the mortality rate for COVID. I've seen numbers all over the place from 0.05% to 8 or 9%, which is wildly different. But those are of a huge magnitude, huge, enormous magnitude of difference of what you're seeing here. The bubonic form of plague cannot be and could not be passed from person to person. So that is, breathing or being around someone who was infected was not enough to infect you. It traveled through the flea bite. But this was evidently and entirely not evident to anyone, since it clearly would travel within households and communities, and it really seemed that once one person got ill, a huge number of people got ill. And it appeared to be extravagantly contagious. So whole households would die, the priests would go to give last rites and they would die, doctors would go to care for the sick and they themselves would contract the disease, a lawyer would be consulted about drawing up a will, and then they would die. So it just seemed obviously that this was contagious from person to person. Some people actually thought it could be transmitted merely through sight. The other two forms of plague are more lethal than this and always fatal. So there's pneumonic plague. Let's get to that. And that is the disease when the bacterium infects the lungs, in which a patient simply can't get enough air, is being choked off from all breath. This is the one form of plague which can be passed directly from one human to another. So drops of saliva can carry the bacillus. This should sound more familiar, and thus can be spread through coughing, sneezing, or even talking. So in this, it seems more like coronavirus. And then the third form of plague is septicemic plague, and that is the plague, the infection gets into the bloodstream, and it will do so in such massive numbers that a victim usually dies before the buboes even form, usually within 24 to 36 hours. So these last two were much rarer, not as evident to 14th century observers, and still gets its is associated with the same Yersinia pestis bacterium. In 1347 to 50, the outbreak most people caught obviously was bubonic plague. Just to repeat, most research suggests that the mortality rate was 50% or maybe even higher in some areas. Our numbers vary, but the disease may well have taken up to 100 million people in the 14th century. So that's it. Next up, religious responses and interpretations. Okay.